All right, so today we're going to be talking about chapter 20, section 2, and we're talking about the various nations from Europe that settled North America. We'll focus a lot on the 13 English colonies, but there were also many different colonies from different European countries in North America. So, to start, let's talk about the French, the English, and the Dutch. So, when you're looking at the east coast of the United States, I'm saying all the lands east of the Mississippi, those were formerly French, English, and Dutch colonies. Now, if you go north of Maine, of course you're into Canada, but you're into a very specific part of Canada called Quebec. It was once a French colony, founded by Samuel de Champlain. Founded the colony of Quebec, again loyal to France. And it was called New France. And the colony extended south of what is today Maine and all the way into what is today Louisiana. And so all the lands west of the Appalachians, east of the Mississippi, once were claimed by France. And so all the Mississippi River Valley, all the Great Lakes, all of those lands, again, were formerly French territories. So New France was huge. But one of the drawbacks, at least in terms of it being economically viable for the French, is that very few people lived there. The fur trade was the main economic activity, and that is, a handful of fur trappers that would go out into the wild for months at a time and bring back with them furs. But these lands weren't very developed. So while Boston and New York and Pennsylvania are going to have rapidly growing populations, New France is very sparsely populated. So a lot of this is based off of the triangular trade system. And I wanted to show you this. Really we're talking about goods going from, say, finished products, guns, furniture, anything made in a factory is coming from Europe. And many of those factory-made goods are being brought, often by Portuguese slave traders, to West Coast Africa states like Ghana or Mali or Niger or Congo. And they're often trading those guns and finished products for goods in Africa and loading up with slaves and going to places like Charleston or the Caribbean or Veracruz or many different, slave trading colonies on the North American continent. And so that's called the triangular trade system. And then in turn, those colonies would produce raw materials like cotton, tobacco, rice, sugar, and they would be shipped over to Europe. Now, the first colony in North America, the first English colony, was Jamestown. Founded, of course, by King James. That was a great point, Ephraim, that many of these places are just named after English monarchs. And now, this colony dates back to 1607. 1607 was the first English colony here. Now, the early years were very difficult. Many people were dying. The only thing really keeping this colony afloat was the fact that every few months a new boatload of settlers would come. Most of them would die off. 6 months later, a new boatload of settlers would come. Times were very difficult. For one, they had poor relations with the natives. Secondly, Jamestown is in a swamp, and so there were numerous problems with disease, with starvation. There were troubles, getting the colony working. And so the early years were difficult. But again, there's a number of different colonies, and we'll spend more time on this in American history, but I just want to go into a few of the different ones. Massachusetts was founded by a group of pilgrims. They called themselves pilgrims because they believed they were on a religious journey. Many of them were separatists from the Anglican Church, Anabaptist or Puritans, and they didn't share the beliefs of the Anglican Church, and so they left England and came to Massachusetts. And their main goal there was to seek the freedom to pursue their religion in the way that they chose. And so many of these families became part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which is today the state of Massachusetts. And it's also one of the oldest colonies in the United States, dating back to 1620. And so they called themselves New England. The Dutch, meanwhile, in 1609, Henry Hudson explored the waterways around what would become New York for the Dutch. Think of the Hudson River named after this person. And so the Dutch laid claim to what they called New Netherland, and it's since been renamed to New York. So that name was changed in the French and Indian War that we'll talk about a little later. But it was a Dutch colony for quite some time. They were mainly focused on the fur trade. They welcomed people from all over, of any belief, of any race. They didn't care because they were primarily a business colony. And so European nations set up interest in the Caribbean, particularly setting up plantations in places like Cuba, which was a Spanish colony, Puerto Rico. These places were established as plantation-based economies with large sugar plantations, cotton, primarily worked by African slaves. So this is a drawing of the colony at Jamestown. And you can see the hangman's noose, you can see the stocks, you can see the interactions between natives and settlers. And also, I wanted to show you this painting of the French and Indian War, the very first global conflict occurred over territories in the New World. England and France fought a war and really brought in many of these colonists because of this war. Now, the various colonies functioned as economic subsidiaries. It was their job to produce raw materials for the mother countries. So cotton, rice, tobacco, sugar, and then they would put these things on boats and they would take them back over. And so it's the job of these settlers to produce these commodities. But yet, we have to remember that Native Americans had dwelt there for many thousands of years, and so they had established lands, and these settlers were encroaching on them. This is going to make relations difficult. And so different countries are going to have different interactions. For example, the French and the Dutch got on well with the Native Americans. They traded, they did business, they respected each other's territory. But the English settlers often had problems. Like the Massachusetts Bay found itself at war with the natives on several occasions. And so, like for example, Metacom went to war against the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1675. But now these wars are less deadly to the natives than the diseases they brought with them. And while the encomienda system endured for a while, that is the practice of enslaving Native Americans, it was eventually abolished and done away with, and African slaves were brought in.